Okay, welcome everyone. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for our May WisACT monthly meeting titled Learning from the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I am Lisa Lewis, the Administrative Manager at the Whitburn Center. Events for the 2025 to 2026 year focused on our partnership with the Wisconsin Alliance for Civic Trust, or WisACT, who hosted monthly network meetings on Wednesdays. Going forward, the Whitburn Wednesday event series and WisACT will be returning to separate monthly meetings. The Wisconsin Alliance for Civic Trust is a cross-partisan network of Wisconsin residents that promotes values fundamental to our democratic republic, including support for fair, safe, and secure elections, and support for peaceful engagement. The WisACT monthly meetings will be the last Wednesday of each month at noon Central Time. And now I'll turn things over to Dr. Paul Van Auken, who will get us started.
Thanks, Lisa. We are discussing a recent trip that some of us from WisACT took to Belfast, Northern Ireland, at a retreat hosted by Rethinking Conflict and the Carter Center. The Carter Center being one of the major supporters of WisACT. We were there to learn from the history of the so-called troubles of Northern Ireland and how we can apply the learnings from this decades-long violent political conflict to our own situation in the U.S. We spoke with civic and political leaders directly involved in both political violence and the peace process, including people who shared heartbreaking experiences related to losing close family members during the Troubles, in which neighbors killed neighbors over political disagreements. We also learned a lot about the peace process. In case you didn't see it, we wrote an op-ed about our experiences. All the authors of the op-ed are listed there. Not everyone could make it to this event today, but I'm going to put a link to a version of the op-ed in the chat that is not behind a paywall. So it was in the Journal Sentinel and some other Gannett, Wisconsin papers, but this version that I'm putting in the chat is up on Yahoo News. So let's check that out if you like. That's a very long looking link, but I think if you click it, you'll get to the article, and that's the main point. With us from our WisACT entourage today are Ariel Goodman and Ellen Rasmussen, and I was also on that trip. I'll just briefly introduce myself and then allow Ariel and Ellen to briefly introduce themselves, and then I'm going to introduce our guest of honor, Gary Mason, in just a minute. So I'm Paul Van Auken. I'm the WisACT coordinator for the Whitburn Center, which manages the WisACT project. I just finished, well, actually, I'm still teaching a class, so the semester is not over, but I'm going on about 20 years in the sociology program at UW Oshkosh, and I'm very happy to be here. So I'll turn it over to you, Ariel, if you want to just briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Ariel Goodman, happy to be here with all of you. My feet touch the ground in Viroqua, Wisconsin, Southwest Wisconsin. I feel really fortunate to call this region home for a little over 4 years. Um, I do a lot of work within organizations building culture right now at Amplify Health as an organizational development consultant, and then also a lot of community building work, predominantly right now with something called Connected for Good, which is a lot about unleashing energy in folks over 50 to channel that towards purpose and community well-being. So I will hand it over to you, Ellen. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you, Ariel. Good to see you again, and Paul and Gary. So I'm Reverend Ellen Rasmussen. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I serve as the pastor of Algoma Boulevard United Methodist Church here in Oshkosh, in addition to serving on WisACT. And just delighted to be reunited with my travel companions, and good to see you, Gary.
Yeah, and Gary, maybe I'll just allow you to introduce yourself in the way that you see fit, and I'll turn it over to you for the first part of our discussion.
Okay, yeah, okay. Look, thank you for the opportunity just to be with you. It's 6 p.m. here in Belfast in Ireland, and we've had a pretty good sunny week, which is unusual for this part of the world at times. So, look, my background is I'm a Methodist clergy person, part of the Methodist Church in Ireland, been ordained for over 30 years. and very much involved in our peace process. I often say if we were having this conversation 30 years ago, in the kind of early 90s onwards, there were primarily three conflicts really grabbing world attention. South Africa, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East. And most people were saying apartheid was ending in South Africa, as it was. It seemed that the Israelis and Palestinians were getting over the line with the Oslo Accords. And the big intractable conflict was the Northern Irish conflict. Here we are 30 plus years later, and the Northern Irish conflict, I often remind my American friends and colleagues, is really one of the best pieces of American foreign policy in the last 50 or 60 years. And it was achieved through really what we would define as soft diplomacy, really relationships, disagreeing well, hearing one another, etc., etc. I'm no longer in parish ministry. The church gave me permission a number of years ago to set up an NGO, Rethinking Conflict. So I primarily do work in the island of Ireland, the Middle East, and also religiously within the United States. Northern Ireland during the conflict was a tiny, tiny space. At 1.5 million people. We've grown to 2 million now since the end of the conflict. So people do want to come here and be here and live their lives here. But really, looking at any conflict, there are three primary concepts. There's land, identity, and religion. It goes something like this. This land is my land, not yours. My identity is superior to yours. And my interpretation of the religious texts is much more accurate than yours. Over that 30-year period of conflict here in the Northern Irish theatre, we had 47,000 injuries, 36,000 shootings, 30,000 people went through our penal system, 22,000 armed robberies, we had 16,000 bombings, and 4,000 dead. To the American mind, that seems pretty minuscule, I guess, in many ways. But I often extrapolate those figures and say if the Northern Irish conflict had have taken place in the US over a 30-year period, you would have had a total of 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, 6 million political prisoners, 4 million armed robberies, and 3 million bombings, and 800,000 dead. So even though the Good Friday Agreement was signed many, many years ago, 28 years ago, April just passed, April the 10th, we are still dealing with the trauma of an internal civil war. I often remind American colleagues and friends that civil war is very, very different to what we would call war in another theater. So Americans maybe think Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. I grew up in that British-Irish tradition. Grandfather fought in the First World War, lost a great uncle in the First World War, obviously that I never knew. My Uncle Jimmy went in with American GIs on the second day of D-Day. Civil wars are different. And I often say to American colleagues as well that civil war in the American mind normally goes back to 1860, 1865. There was a very clear demarcation line then, North versus South. Our civil war was neighbor killing neighbor. So someone in the next street wanted to kill you because your identity was British or Irish, or your religion was Protestant or Catholic, or your politics were unionist or nationalist. And that's why civil wars are so, so traumatic. More people have committed suicide in the Northern Irish conflict than actually died in the conflict. 1 in 5 people are drinking themselves to death, self-medicating through alcohol. We have the highest dosage of antidepressants in Western Europe and one of the highest in the world. And we're still seen as a successful peace process. What were some of the key things in bringing the conflict to an end? Early 90s, we had what was defined as a mutually hurting stalemate. So the British were never going to defeat the IRA. The IRA were never going to defeat the British. It was impossible. And the loyalist pro-British groupings were not going to defeat the IRA. With enough weaponry in the island of to kill each other for another 50 years. but political and religious leadership on both sides of the divide, who didn't necessarily agree about the constitutional future, realized enough is enough. When British troops come on the streets in August 1969, common wisdom of the day was, oh, this will be over by Christmas. Well, it wasn't. It was the longest military operation in British history. And what you're doing in Wisconsin and many other states across the United States is not necessarily always agreeing. I often quote one of the more conservative writers of the New York Times, Bret Stephens, who says, in order to disagree well, you need to understand well. So I'm not asking Democrats or Republicans to agree any more than nationalists or unionists agree in my space. But I'm asking people to have what we would call in our Northern Irish context uncomfortable conversations. They're difficult conversations, but in those conversations, humanizing the other person. And that's where language is really, really important. The late Jonathan Sacks, the brilliant Jewish theologian, uses the phrase linguistic violence. In other words, the violence of the tongue. And in your space, in my space, in the Middle East at the moment, in many spaces, even in Europe and in Africa, the language of the tongue is literally at record highs. So how do we bring people together to humanize each other? Because we all know dehumanization precedes genocide. If you dehumanize an individual, it is much easier to kill them. So even concepts that may seem childlike, almost like listening and storytelling, psychologically are absolutely key. So I'll just finish with this for the moment, and then we can move it to another direction from some of the panelists. I remember when I was a little boy, so I'm going to take every person listening to this tonight, I'm going to rewind the DVD right back to you were 5 or 6 years of age, okay? You're in bed, your PJs, your pajamas are on, and a mom, a dad, a big brother, a big sister, grandparent comes in the rooms, opens a book and says 4 magic words. Once upon a time. And I'm sure if you're anything like me, you kind of set up because you want to hear the story. So I want to ask American religious actors, political actors, civic leaders, in America, are you creating what I would call once upon a time moments? The academic Goskal says that science has long proven that storytelling is one of the most effective mechanisms for changing a person's mind. So what does once upon a time moments look like in the United States today? George Mitchell, the senator who painfully chaired our talks for 2 years and eventually got us to the Good Friday Agreement. It was said of him, he listened Northern Ireland into peace. Is it possible in a very fractured US at the moment that those listening skills may not necessarily lead to agreement, but at least that Americans realize you are Americans, you're a great nation, and that you hear one each other much better through the act of listening and the act of storytelling. Those mechanisms of humanizing each other in a bloodbath here. 1972, we had a terrorist incident every 40 minutes. Think of that, every 40 minutes. And no nation in their right mind wants to pursue that goal because on all sides, unionist, nationalist, Republican, loyalist, the pain is still there. By all means, have your healthy political debates. That's important. But never, never resort to violence to settle your differences. We're an example still struggling. After a 30-year civil war, 28 years later, no nation in their right mind wants to do that. So I'll press the pause button there and pass back to Paul, and he will lead us through the next few moments.
Thanks very much, Gary. I think we have a plan where Gary is going to ask panelists to share some experiences, and we're going to flip it around and ask Gary a few questions that have struck us afterwards. But I think it strikes me that maybe we could open it up right now for audience members. If anybody is struck by something they heard Gary say, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to share it now, and then we can move on from there. Anybody have anything they want to say now? Otherwise, we'll keep going. And we'll make time for some Q&A at the end too. Okay, then I'm going to pass the baton back to you, Gary. And
Okay, and I will go. So I work from my left. So Ariel, um, what were some of the lessons? And I often say, look, no conflicted space is identical. And I often smile when politicians, bless them, I have many political friends, when they say, "Oh, the Good Friday Agreement is the template for the Middle East." I go, "No, it's not. There are lessons from the Good Friday Agreement that may have applicability in the Middle East, but you just can't lift one document and drop it in another situation because every place is different. Culturally, you need to contextualize it. But Ariel, what were some of the things that may have struck home to you as a civic leader and as a person as you saw both sides come together, not wanting to kill each other, not agreeing politically, but realizing there's a better way to handle difference?
Yeah. It's it's really beautiful to listen to you talk, Gary, because it's bringing me back to the experience. Um, One, just kind of the urgency around the things in our own context, we're able to kind of sweep underneath the rug. That there's real urgency and stakes about our experience, and connected to that is how deeply you care and our friends in Ireland and Belfast care that we don't find ourselves in the same cycles of violence at the level and degree that you found, and that deep care and not wanting to perpetuate the same mistakes. I want to say thank you. And that really struck and stood with me. I'm going to actually bring in the perspective of one of our fellow travelers because he wrote, this is Ali Khalil, who's not able to be with us today, but he wrote something in this article that also stayed with me as a really big learning. He said, "My biggest learning from Northern Ireland is that bridge building isn't only a moral imperative, it is self-interest, properly understood. When whole communities feel sidelined, they do not stay sidelined quietly. The problem is structural and how we often fail to communicate it properly, mutually assured prosperity or mutually assured destruction. Those are the options. So, what does this actually look like here in the US? It starts before alignment, persuasion, or any attempt to change a mind. It starts with understanding. It means attending a city council meeting in a neighborhood that isn't yours, or showing up with curiosity at a mosque, open house, or parish fish fry. It also means paying attention to where common ground already exists. Across my home state of Wisconsin right now, residents from sharply different political backgrounds are finding each other in opposition to data center development in their towns and in support of restrictive private equity ownership of single family homes and apartment complexes. These are not small issues. They touch land, water, housing, and the question of who gets to shape a community's future. They can also be entry points. Relationships built around shared local concerns create the trust that makes harder conversations possible later. So we have to bring everyone along in the conversation, and we have to meet people where they're at. And it goes back to the George Mitchell quote that you said, Gary, that um, George Mitchell listened Northern Ireland into peace. Like how do we, and I love how Ali framed it. It's bridge building is of it isn't only moral imperative, it's self-interest. Because at the end of the day, if we don't bring people along in the process, um, and this is something I want to explore with you later in our conversation, it resurfaces, that trauma, that hurt resurfaces, and more pain and suffering and violence is enacted. We have to tend to the root. We have to get to the essence down deep of what is causing these cycles of violence. And a lot of time it is building relationships, witnessing, understanding, seeing, connecting people who often are very different than us. And that's hard, but it's
Yeah.
so, so imperative.
No, that's super, Al. And it's just it's honesty. All of us know who are in relationships, marriages, partnerships, whatever.
Hmm.
They work because of honesty.
Aw.
Deceit and conversation ultimately implodes relationships. And I mean, I'm saying this in a Christian context. There'll be other people from who are atheists listening in, agnostics, people of the Jewish tradition, Islamic tradition. I think people from my Christian tradition need to be honest when the church gets it wrong, and it often does get it wrong. I mean, as one theologian said, on one point, and it is a substantial one, the critics of religion are right. Religion has done harm. It has led to crusades, inquisitions, jihads, and pogroms. People have killed in the name of the God of love, practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion, waged war in the name of the God of peace. I mean, those are undeniable facts. But yet sometimes religious people don't want to own up to a very sordid, difficult history. We need to do that if we're going to move forward.
Gary, I just want to pull on one thread and then I want to hear from the other panelists. I love you use the word honesty.
Yeah,
What I also hear is vulnerability,
yeah,
right? Because when we're vulnerable, it involves us feeling emotions and uncertainty, risk, and there's a bit of emotional exposure. But
yeah.
in order to enact acts of courage, we all need to be vulnerable and deeply human with each other. And what a beautiful gift that we get to do that together. Yes.
No, no, superb. Okay, Ellen, any thoughts or comments or things you took back to the United States from your time in Belfast?
Thank you. First, I want to offer a blessing for our colleagues who are celebrating Eid today. Uh, it's a major Muslim holiday, and they are with their families and wish them blessings for this holy day. I think there are a number of things that resonate with me. Um, One of the quotes that are statements that I wrote down is wars encourage people to move to the extremes, and a peace agreement has to gather everybody and draw them to the well, I have where everyone has skin in the game. And you talked about the different parties that had to be involved, and you especially lifted up that women need to be at the table. And so I would like to hear more from you about how you achieved that.
Yeah, and interestingly, a lot of that began in impoverished inner city areas, Ellen, because mostly the prisoners that went to prison, many for many, many years, women were left holding those communities together, many with young families. And then as time began to evolve, they were able to take what I would call, and even in a religious context, thoughtful, strategic, prophetic risks. Not stupidity or recklessness, but thoughtful, where they were finding a woman living 100 yards away from them on the other side of a fence that was separating these communities was having exactly the same problems. Loneliness, husband in prison, trying to bring up children. And that's not, I am not under any circumstances rubber stamping the violent acts that took place in this society because they were wrong. But it's not enough just to say they didn't, they just appeared. I mean, as one of my colleagues said, someone in the late 1960s did not fly over Northern Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we all woke up and said, let's start killing each other. There was a context, sadly, a context of extremism politically and extremism within a religious context that really I saw many of my boyhood friends sadly end up in prison. I didn't. I mean, I ended up becoming a religious leader, but it would be remiss of me if I didn't ask where the roots of this conflict lay. It was very much a male dominated conflict. It was very much a male dominated society. And in the 90s, women began to move into very strategic positions and gradually move people towards peace. I mean, it's well researched by many, many leading academics, both conservative and liberal. There's no one has a handle on this, on both traditions, where women are at the table. And this is proven through major academic research. A peace process has much more chance of holding. And that was absolutely crucial in relation to that. And maybe it's something to do, and I said it's the detriment of my own gender and that kind of alpha male personality, where women had the ability to come in and soften some of those conversations to allow people to hear better, to allow people, to quote Ariel, to feel vulnerable, to tell those stories that humanize one another. And I mean, suffice to say, we wouldn't have had a peace process without women taking those strategic, thoughtful, prophetic risks. That's factual.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a follow-up question, if I may, or
Yeah, of
share.
course. Yeah.
So you just lifted up that, the women were raising their families in poverty. And one of the concerns that is heavy on my heart for all of my neighbors uh, is the high cost of food
Yeah.
that people are experiencing, combined with the gutting of safety net programs and support of local food pantries, combined with the fact that due to the war in Iran, there are fields that are laying unplanted because of the high cost of fertilizer. And so we're moving into a season where um, we may in the US, for many folks, experience food scarcity for the first time. And that's going to create, right, a greater uncertainty. How, as we, as leaders across communities caring for our people, address this increased in insecurity? Because if people are hungry, they're in survival mode,
Yeah.
right? And how can we help? How can we work this together?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to draw on a tradition you know well. It's, I mean, the Methodist tradition, which is a tradition that shaped me. And I'm not being over holy or spiritual in saying this. Methodism really is a twin track approach to community difference and difficulties and poverty. On the one hand, it was sort of somebody once described it like a bird with two wings, personal holiness on one side and social holiness on the other. And all of our listeners tonight know if you kind of cut off a wing of one bird, the bird collapses. Um, so Methodist missions was a thing that began here really in the British context, Irish context, Australian context, South African context, where those missions were reaching out to people in impoverished situations. Now, today I would be suggesting in your space and that story you've just told me, how do you combine the sacred and the secular? Because a person on this conversation tonight, no one wants people to die of hunger. No one wants people driven towards stealing or theft towards hunger. So religious actors of the Methodist tradition in Wisconsin can't do that on their own. So how do you combine with secular agencies, agencies of other faith, and do what I would call a kind of corporate approach to this here? I think too many times, too many agencies have this kind of ourselves alone mentality. I found in the inner city, I chaired an organization called the Inner East Forum, and the way we found it was bringing together clergy, police, youth workers, women's groups, city councillors. So it was a more coordinated and coherent approach to poverty in the inner city, rather than having all these different strands. At times, let's be honest, competing with one another for very little resources, particularly financially. So, I mean, if I was in your position, I'd be reaching out to say, look, how do we address this corporately? And what does that look like? And I'd also be listening to the people that are struggling with these difficulties. The assumption sometimes of religious leaders is we know best, we'll come in, we'll sort it out. You'll only sort it out if you hear the pain, the agony, and the humanizing of those who feel marginalized. I just think that's an absolutely key component in relation to that.
Thank you.
Paul, in your hands, go ahead. Just
Yeah,
what struck you in that intense week of 6 or 7 days?
it was. I think first, just for the benefit of people who weren't there, one something that amazing about the whole experience was just the people that we had the opportunity to interact with. starting with Gary, but all kinds of people that Gary brought in for us to hear from and be able to talk to, people who have held very high levels of, political positions in society there in Northern Ireland, who were, instrumental in the peace process, and were involved with the conflict on both sides, and now have, been able to reconcile, had family members die, and are able to move forward. Um, a famous Irish folk musician, Tommy Sands, who's going to be at Milwaukee's Irish Fest this summer, and I intend to go see him. He was there as part of a conference within a conference that we got to attend, and that was pretty profound. So all those experiences were just amazing. I think part of what's really been resonating with me is two different points from our op-ed, one of which is telling the truth about the health of American democracy and then agreeing on what the problem is. We had the opportunity to have some internal conversations as Americans over there trying to learn that brought some really important issues to a head. Um, and, those were some of the conversations that struck me the most about how well, and made me think about how that relates to Wisconsin, where, our mission with WisACT is to try to build trust, but we have a state that's one of the worst for racial integration in the entire country. So we can talk about building trust amongst people that are involved with civic life already, but we're missing a huge part of the problem that comes before that, which is, do we have trust between people of different socioeconomic and racial backgrounds in Wisconsin? And we have a lot of work to do in that regard. So with recent Supreme Court decision, I heard a commentator say that, we didn't have a democratic country in the United States until 1965. And now we're on the precipice of losing a lot of the gains that we made as a society. And this is some pretty deep, disturbing stuff that's been here a long time and hasn't been dealt with. So I've been thinking a lot about that sort of thing and what we do about it. I'm gonna segue to the next stage of our discussion by opening up to the panelists who were prompted to come up with a question that they have for Gary. I think Ellen did that. She probably has more though, but I guess one thing related to what I was just saying, Gary, that I'd like to hear you talk more about is, we learned that the peace process has existed pretty much since the conflict started in Northern Ireland, and that the women from the inner cities that you were talking about and others involved with the peace process were highly influenced by the civil rights movement in the United States. And I think it'd be interesting for people to hear a little bit more about that. And I guess kind of based on what I was just saying now, there are calls in the United States. We needed a new civil rights movement to try to get back to even where we were. But maybe you could comment a little bit about how the civil rights movement in the U.S. has played a role in Northern Ireland.
Yes, I mean, Northern Ireland was established. I mean, look, as most people listen to this, we could go back to the 12th century. So, I mean, Ireland has been a very, very troublesome island for many, many years. No doubt, aspects of what I would call toxic religion and toxic politics have shaped this place literally for centuries. I remember as a very young clergy person being on a working party in sectarianism in the early 1990s. I was a sort of young Protestant in that with another lifelong friend now, Martin O'Brien, who was the young Catholic. And sadly, we very quickly found ourselves back in the 16th and 17th century. Kind of Protestant Reformation, Catholic Counter-Reformation. And as someone at that stage quite young, I mean, reading stories that were horrendous, absolutely barbaric is the only way to describe this. And these acts were being done in the name of God. People boiled in oil, uh, women's stomachs sliced open, pregnant women and babies cut out because you were on the other side. I mean, no matter what person's theological position is tonight listening into this, conservative, centrist, or liberal, those things are fundamentally wrong. And if religion drives people to do that, I think we need to press the pause button and have a long, hard look and what is actually driving people towards doing that. I've often said, Paul, I mean, being a civic leader, a religious leader has advantages. It's also disadvantages as well. I mean, some of the homes I've sat in at 2 a.m. in the morning, you mentioned some of those people that you met, innocent lives blown up in horrific bombings or in shootings or killings. And they're forgotten about inside 24 hours because the next casualty is reported. But the families are left with those. So I would be pleading for Americans, both Republican and Democrat, what does compassion look like? Or maybe ask yourself the question, if that was my 7-year-old son or daughter or my parent or my sister. The problem with death and a human concept, there's a finality about it as regards life on planet Earth. I mean, I'm not going into a debate around the afterlife tonight, but it's final for the time we're on planet Earth, and the scars don't leave people. But sometimes the sociologists call it's the othering. Oh, it's one of them. And I mean, I tell a story, which is a true story of a group of nice little old ladies coming to what in the world of evangelicalism we would have called the gospel service at 7 p.m. on a Sunday evening to get the sinners saved. And one old lady turns to the other and says, I hear someone was shot dead last night. And the little old lady sitting beside her says, don't be worrying, dear. It wasn't one of ours. And 10 minutes later, they're involved in an act of worship to God without any recollection of what they just said. So no matter tonight you're conservative, centrist, liberal, that's just wrong. Because I'll tell you this, if that was any of my kids, I mean, as I've often said to people quite openly, as a parent, you know what? I want to be dead before any of my kids are dead. Full stop. I've buried too many children. I've watched the pain of too many parents. I want to die before my kids. And I'm sure most people listening in, people in the panel, those listening in want to do that. If we don't deal with acts of violence, viciousness, demonization, dehumanizing of the other person, this sadly is the end result. I was 12 years of age when I first read a book about the Holocaust of the Shoah. Um, I was 12, and I mean, it blew my mind. But as time went on, I realized that religion played a very, very significant role in that, demonizing the other person. And as one Jewish theologian who marched with Martin Luther King Jr. many, many years ago, Abraham Joshua Shell said, it was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. Because long before the death camps, long before Zyklon B, long before Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Belsen, Dhaka, and I visited many of them over the years, with the intention and the underlying thesis being this is the end result of hating another group of people, genocide. It was language in the late 20s, early 30s that paved the way for the Shoah. So I am appealing to everyone listening tonight, no matter what your political perspective is, disagree well, but don't dehumanize the other person because you're laying a foundation for people to take another person's life. And I saw that time after time after time after time. And our civil rights movement began here, Paul, primarily because when our state of Northern Ireland was set up, it was set up with a 2/3 majority, 1/3 Catholic minority, and there was discrimination in education and housing, etc., etc. The difficulty is, as I mentioned earlier, once conflict begins, it's very difficult to stop. And that's why I would plead the Americans, despite your political and religious differences, there's a better way to do this. I mean, as to quote Jonathan Sacks again, within our three monotheistic religions, he asked the question, does the God of Abraham want his disciples to kill each other? I think the answer to that is categorically no, he doesn't. So how do we ensure that doesn't happen? And I think the only way is through those, what I was defining as those uncomfortable, difficult conversations. We had a chance to bring this all to an end in 1974. We had a peace agreement, but extremists on both sides crashed it. It was called the Sunningdale Agreement, and someone humorously said, and I smile at this still, but I have to unpack it. He said, "Oh, actually, the Good Friday Agreement was Sunningdale for slow learners." Because we could have got this in 1974. And I smile and say, yeah, that's true. The problem is with the slow learning, we ended up with tens of thousands more injuries and thousands more deaths. So sometimes there's a prophetic voice that needs to be said, enough is enough, because if we go over the precipice, as we did, a friend of mine called it, we're on a hamster wheel to hell. And we just couldn't pull it back. So civic voices in both your political traditions, religious traditions, need to be speaking into that space. And as you said, Paul, many of these people are not engaging. So what is the role of civic actors in bringing people together for those once upon a time human moments, engaging moments, to hear each other and say, look, we're not going to agree. But I often begin these conversations with saying, I'm assuming everyone in this room agrees with one thing. We want to preserve life. So no one's going to say, oh, well, I don't. I want to destroy life. Well, I said, well, you actually shouldn't be in this room then. You need to go and get some form of therapy or psychology. Most people will say, yeah, you know, Gary, I do want to preserve life. Well, can we forget about our interpretations of our sacred texts or political texts? If we want to preserve life, is that a building block to move forward in the divided society? Because who wants to blow up an 8-month-old baby? Well, people did in my situation. Who the hell in their right mind would do that? But once you descend down that chaos, anything is on the table. And this was not pretty. Not pretty at all. A friend of mine said to me once, went to school together. He said, Gary, I go to sleep at night with the faces of the dead on my ceiling. In a few hours' time, I'll go into the room just behind my bookshelves. I'll turn out my light. I'll pray with my wife. And I don't go to sleep at night with the faces of the dead, thank God, on my ceiling. But this was a young boy, 15, 16. What in the name of God compelled him to do that? Linguistic violence. Demonizing by leaders of the other person. They're not human. They're scum, etc., etc. So at 16 years of age, you go out and kill someone. It happens all over the world. But as a nation of America, with a brilliant, profound religious tradition over the years, with many bumps as well, I'm not sanitizing your history anymore, and I'm sanitizing mine. But who in their right mind wants to see a nation like yours turning in and killing each other? Absolute insanity.
Thanks, Gary. We have about 10 minutes left because then again, we want to give people a chance to fill out a survey. But we want to do some Q&A. So Ariel, Ellen, if you had another question that has been on your mind that you want to ask Gary, please do. And the rest of the audience, though, if you want to put something in the chat or raise your hand so we're ready to take some other questions, that would be excellent.
I actually have two that I'm balancing, but I'm going to go with this one first. You had lifted up to us 7 principles for the path forward. And the first one being that the guns had to go.
Yeah.
And then on the opposite page, I said, if it doesn't, I think the peace process doesn't involve compromise, then there is no long-term solution. And we know the weapons, the bombings, the violence was so huge. Could you address how, how did you get people to put down the weapons?
Yeah. Long, protracted process, but let me just try to highlight it. The phrase that was used in the Good Friday Agreement was that weapons had to be decommissioned. Now, as well as that, weapons being decommissioned, I often use the phrase, we also needed to decommission people's minds. Because weapons are easily accessible on planet Earth, as we all know. But the weapons decommissioning was really what was defined as a confidence building measure. That really people saw that these people who had guns for reasons to kill others, politically, religiously, etc., they had to be removed from society. So that was a confidence building measure that was absolutely crucial. The other thing there, Ellen, that you realize the word compromise. And there's a number of ways I could play about with this in the English language. Look, my relationship works with my kids, my friends, and all of you as well, because I'm willing to compromise. I don't want to be some benign, dogmatic, arrogant dictator. The history of dictatorship on planet Earth is not pretty. Nazi Germany is a typical example. And I mean, again, going back to the Shoah, Adolf Hitler was not a card-carrying evangelical or an observant Catholic, but Hitler used religion cleverly. I got into a debate with someone about the role of religion in the Shoah, who disagreed with me, which is fine. But I just quoted him from the second chapter of Mein Kampf, where Hitler said, "Today I believe I'm acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator and defending myself against the Jews." You put a dictator and what I call toxic religion together, it's a recipe for disaster. So compromise is not a bad word. People don't want to use the word compromise. Use the word accommodation. They're interchangeable. You're compromising or you're accommodating me. None of us could exist without some form of compromise or accommodation. Our partnerships, our marriages, our relationship with our kids, our work colleagues would implode. So why is it that when we come to invariably politics and religion, there's no accommodation? And that's a challenge for many, many segregated and divided societies globally today. And so then what is the role of religious leaders? What is the role of political leaders? What is the role of civic leaders in showing accommodation? I mean, a good negotiator always looks at the other side of the table and says this: if not my political enemies, but my political opponents, enemy can conjure up all sorts of images. If I don't give my political opponents enough to sell to their constituency, this is all going to spiral downhill. Because people feel humiliated, and we all know, listen, go back to when we were all kids in the playground, human nature being what it is. You know, if someone kicked me and humiliated me, I wanted to kick them back. So humiliation is never a good tool to use within the world. But accommodation and compromise is. And yet we've made those words almost dirty, weak words. I think it actually takes a strong person to accommodate or to compromise. To me, that shows steel. It also shows wisdom. And there's a lot of wisdom needed in a very, very, very fractured world at the moment. My second oldest son texts me with the state of planet Earth, and he said, "Dad, is there going to be a third world war?" I turned to my wife Joyce and I said this honestly. I said to all your listeners, never, never, never in my wildest dreams did I ever think any kid of mine would ever say that to me. Do you know what, Ellen, the irony is? I couldn't say, no, son, there's not. Because planet Earth is not in good shape. And so we need American political leaders. We need European political leaders. We need Asian political leaders. We need African political leaders to be giving leadership that the way to resolve our difference is not through linguistic violence or weaponry. There's a better way to do things. I would argue strongly that the Second World War, within theological terms, was a just war. There's no question about that. I don't think there was any other option. But I guess if we had a debate, I mean, who wants to see our young generation spilling into another war? It's just not healthy. And the scars are there forever, as we all know. So another question or comment. I'm just keeping an eye. With 4 minutes, do you guys do your survey? So the question from that very quiet audience, if you want to read those out, well, I'm kind of just, they're very tiny on my screen at the moment. If someone wants to read it
Yeah,
out,
You
Oh, go
see,
ahead.
Kevin? Yeah, Kevin just posted something in the chat that you probably all see. We recognize the components of the peace process and discuss the key persons. We have the 7 parts of the process. I missed some, but what about the framework of the people involved? I'm fascinated and was by how important journalists were in the process, negotiations were journalists. My question, if I had to put together a team to start with, who needs to be there?
Yeah, I would say everybody needs to be at
Yeah.
the table there, Kevin, categorically. You need a critical mass. And also just to say, look, I have many friends who are politicians. And politicians know this if you're listening in tonight. Look, politics by its nature can be quite adversarial. So if we look at our parliament, which is just a mile over my right shoulder here up in Stormont, it's been a bit of stop-start government, to be honest. And people often say to me, Gary, when your politics is still a bit fractured, etc., etc., why have you not gone back to war? I say this simply and honestly. Civic society is the social glue that holds our peace process together. Let me say that again. Civic society is the social glue that holds our peace process together. Who is civic society? Religious leaders, women's groups, youth groups, journalists, academics, and many, many others. So don't rule out civic society. The majority of people in the United States are part of civic society. That's what makes up the US. Politics will always be adversarial. There's no doubt politics in many of our spaces could be a lot more gracious. I remember I made a New Year's resolution there, I think last year. I said, you know what, in 2025, I'm going to try just to be a little bit more kind. And you know what? It worked. Because I found when I wasn't racing, I held the door open. Then the person said, are you okay? Everything okay? Thanks for doing that. Just kindness. Ariel, you were jumping in there with a
Yeah,
comment.
I
I don't
just
want to
think this is
interrupt.
actually, David says something that's really beautiful and also on my heart and mind, and maybe a way to close before the survey, but just outstanding program. Thank you. In my experience, heart and mind change that leads to compromise and peace is very much possible, but tends to move at a snail's pace. Meanwhile, unnecessary suffering across the world and in our own communities moves at a rabbit's pace. This keeps me up at night. Me too, David, because these two things are moving in opposite directions. Any words of hope to convince us that heart and mind changes can keep pace with unnecessary suffering? Gary, maybe a way to close or anything else that anyone wants to add.
You know, look, for all of us, I suppose I would say to all my American colleagues, both Republican, Democrat, many different religious traditions and those with none, how do you breathe the oxygen of hope into the United States? Why do I say that? Well, I say this, and I know I'm speaking for every single person in this tonight. See, if I get cancer, I hope I get better. If I fail my exams, not that I'm doing many at my age, I hope I get the resits. If I lose my job, I hope I get another. How do we breathe the oxygen of hope and belief into a very fractured, divided world? What does that look like? And the key is, I think, just, don't give up. It is doable. Many hopeless situations have been redeemed in so many different ways.
Mhm.
Look, I'll let you guys go, and it's great to see you all again, and we'll no doubt keep in touch as well. So, look, bless you all, and thank you so much for allowing me to share with you as well.
Thanks so much for joining us, Gary.
Okay.
It was excellent.
Okay, look, best wishes. I will run. I have a 7:30 meeting here in Belfast city centre that I need to drive to. So I'll see you all soon. Best wishes
Take
now.
care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, and before we wrap up, I want to take a few minutes for something important. We have our member survey open right now. This is how the Carter Center and WisACT know what's working, what to improve, and how to make the case that networks like ours are helping to strengthen our democracy. It's anonymous and takes 5 to 7 minutes. Let's all open it right now together. I just put the link in the chat. We can pause for a few minutes so everyone has time to complete it. And then also, I think Paul put in the chat information for our next meeting, our next WisACT monthly meeting, which will be Wednesday, June 24th. So mark your calendars for that, and we'll send out information about that in a later date. But for now, everybody, please take a few minutes to complete this survey. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to everyone for being here.